Hi everyone, it's Mr. Cinti, and today I have the pleasure to be discussing with you one of the greatest organs that the female body and baby can produce together as one, which is the placenta. That's right, the placenta is an organ that it develops during pregnancy, and as you can see, it's located right here within the womb of the woman, which is the uterus. And so we're going to get into a discussion about its anatomy and its physiology, and I think you're going to enjoy it because it's one of the cool things about pregnancy that this placenta forms. Because the thing about it is the uterus where the baby is developing is inside the uterus. It's a really, really strong muscular organ. And again, it has to be muscular because it's this contraction of the uterine wall which is going to be forcing the baby out during delivery. But the thing about it is the placenta, and I thought I'd start off with just an actual picture of the placenta, as you can see in this tray. The placenta is delivered after the baby. It's sometimes referred to as afterbirth, and as you can see here, this is the umbilical cord right here, which is connecting to the newborn. And so it's an organ that connects the developing fetus inside the uterus. It's connected to the inner wall of the uterus, as you can see here. And so it connects to the baby via the umbilical cord, or the fetus, I should say. And basically, it allows nutrients that the mother is eating and gases, principally oxygen, that the mother is breathing in to travel into the baby, because whatever the mother is breathing and eating, it needs to go into the baby. And conversely, the baby needs to get rid of its carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide then goes into the placenta and then out, and the mother breathes it out of her lungs. It's quite remarkable. And also the baby needs to eliminate a little bit of waste as well. If you recall somewhere in your past knowledge, the baby is also producing nitrogenous waste in the terms of urea, and that needs to be filtered out by the placenta as well. So it's an incredible organ, and there's a lot of blood vessels involved, and that's what this conversation is going to be all about. But I just want to give you a little bit of background here. This is a non-pregnant model of a female anatomy here, and here you can see this sort of pear-shaped structure in the center. Here, the abdominal cavity, the intestines are removed so you can see this, but this is the uterus. Notice the inside, this is where the baby, the lumen is where the fetus is developing, and this is where the placenta is going to form. There's an endometrium, a myometrium, and a parametrium, and the myometrium is very muscular, and the uterus sits anatomically superior to the female urinary bladder. And as you can see here is the cervix, or opening to the birth canal. And so when you see this picture, this is kind of a familiar picture too. Here's the uterus, and so what we're describing as far as placenta is that this is going to be growing inside of the uterus here. And you can see here's the ovaries and the fallopian tube. Here's the cervix. So I like to show histological slides, and so this is the showing how many blood vessels. There's so many blood vessels in the endometrium, and so this is endometrium of the uterus is going to extend itself and form the female part of the placenta. And then here you can see the strong muscular wall of the myometrium and the parametrium here. So that's a look at the layers of the uterine wall. Here's an actual picture of the uterus. Here's the ovaries, here's the fallopian tubes as well. So this is what we're talking about, the uterus. And so what I wanted to say at the beginning of this discussion right out of the gate is that the fetus, when developing inside the uterus, is basically enclosed, and they're basically swimming in this fluid called amniotic fluid, which is located inside this membrane called the amniotic sac, right in here, or a bag of waters. And so basically, what I'm getting at here is that the fetus is surrounded by this fluid, which means that its lungs are filled with this amniotic fluid. And so the baby isn't breathing air, which means that it needs to get everything from the blood of the mother. And so it needs to get oxygen from the mother's blood. and it needs to get nutrients from the mother's blood. It's not eating inside of here. So the only connection is this umbilical cord, which is really important. And it's the umbilical cord which connects to the placenta, which is located right here. And so if the baby wants to get rid of its carbon dioxide, it needs to be through the umbilical cord to the placenta. And so this placenta is really important. It provides the solution for the baby to get oxygen and get nutrients and rid itself of waste such as carbon dioxide. So the placenta is the solution. I want you to be thinking about that. So the fetus, as it turns out, let me attempt to make a drawing here of this. And so inside the uterus, okay, kind of a crude drawing of the uterus here. Okay, inside the uterus, what we're talking about is, let's switch colors here. So the fetus is sitting in here, okay, and here's the head, like that. And so what's going on is that the fetus is going to send up some blood vessels to the placenta. And so the blood vessels that it's going to send up are, and let me go with these first, are arteries. Okay, so this is going up towards the placenta. This is going into the belly button here. Okay, so it sends up 2 arteries like that. And so we use the term arteries to describe a blood vessel that is taking blood away from the heart. And in this case, it's the fetal heart. So away from the heart, we're talking about the blood vessels called arteries. And so these arteries are traveling up toward the placenta. And so the placenta, let me draw in up here. I'll make it yellow up here. Okay, like that. And so the placenta itself is going to be then providing, as I was saying, this is the mother's body. And so the mother is going to be providing in a blood vessel like this called an artery. I'm sorry, a vein. This is the umbilical vein. Is going to be bringing oxygenated blood to the baby in order to get nutrients and oxygen. And so collectively, these 3 blood vessels are going to be enclosed in this tube called the umbilical cord. And so this is what the umbilical cord is right here. The umbilical cord is made up of these 3 blood vessels. And again, coming toward the baby in a vein and going away from the baby are these arteries. Okay? So this is perhaps a better drawing of that. So this is inside the uterus. Here's the birth canal right here. Here's the umbilical cord, which is connecting to the belly button. And so inside this, we re-illustrated. Inside of this, you have 2 umbilical arteries, like this, umbilical arteries that are coming up like that, and 1 umbilical vein, which is coming this way toward the baby, and it has oxygenated blood, and this is what's inside the umbilical cord. You're like, well, what's the story with the umbilical arteries? How come they're blue? Well, they're deoxygenated, and so the idea is that they need to pick up oxygen from the mother, and then it returns in the umbilical vein toward the heart over here, so that the baby can pump it through the body. So the umbilical cord carries blood vessels to the placenta. So that's what the umbilical cord is. And again, it picks up oxygen and it gets rid of carbon dioxide and it picks up nutrients. And this is a sonogram of the umbilical cord using ultrasound. So the umbilical vein, as I was mentioning before, is red. And so I color-coded that red because it's oxygenated. And it's bringing oxygenated blood from the placenta toward the fetus. And so we always call veins going toward the heart. So it's the heart of the fetus. And so the vein, its color is therefore red because it's coming from the placenta, which is getting lots of oxygen from the mother, and it's heading toward the baby. And that's how the baby gets its oxygen, through the umbilical vein. Now these umbilical arteries are taking deoxygenated blood away to the placenta. So it's away from the heart. It's therefore in arteries. Arteries away. That's a good way to remember that. Arteries away from the fetal heart, going to the placenta in order to get oxygen, therefore they're blue. And so if you were to take a look at this, in terms of the umbilical cord cross-section like this, if you were to take a slice of the umbilical cord, I kind of recall this from college. The way to remember these umbilical arteries is sort of to do with this. There's two of them like that, and so it's like a little bit of a face. So you got these arteries like this, and then the umbilical vein, as I was mentioning before, there's one of them, and it's like this. It's kind of like a happy face, and you can also remember it, a little silly, but you can remember this because it's sort of the mouth is like a V for vein, and this is obviously oxygenated blood, and it's going toward the fetus. Okay, so that's one way to recall that. Now, here's an actual cross-section of the umbilical cord, and so this is what we're getting at in terms of the umbilical vein is located right there, and then here are your, obviously they're not letter A's, but these are your arteries right up here, so it's like a face. Now, these blood vessels are not just freely floating in the umbilical cord, they're actually enclosed in this mucus protein jelly-like material called Wharton's jelly, after the person who first identified this material. This jelly kind of reminds me of the jelly that's found in the eye, and if you're familiar with the structure of the eye, the vitreous humor. So it's this jelly-like material, and it's very interesting, this Wharton's jelly. It has some interesting properties, and so when the baby is first delivered, the severe temperature change allows the Wharton's jelly to contract a little bit, therefore squeezing these blood vessels, which kind of provides a natural clamp for a couple of minutes. Although it's not obviously as good as an actual clamp. And so when the baby is delivered, obviously when the baby comes out of the mother, the umbilical cord is still connected to the mother, which is still connected to the placenta inside the uterus. And so sometimes the father of the baby is allowed to cut. I had the privilege of being able to cut my children's umbilical cord, and this is actually a photograph of my son Bryce's umbilical cord. And so what the surgeon will do is they'll clamp it, and then you can cut it. And it doesn't cause any pain because there's no nerves located inside of the umbilical cord. Now, what's interesting about the umbilical cord, many things, is that the jelly itself and some of the red blood cells, and there's white blood cells in there, and there's some fibroblast cells, if you're familiar with these cells. There's stem cells that are located inside this cord blood, and there's a lot of optimism with regard to this. And so sometimes parents like to bank the umbilical cord because those stem cells could be harvested, and there's a lot of hope in terms of curing diseases like, for example, leukemia, and using this cord blood. And so it's pretty cool. Just wanted to point that out. And so here you could see a connection right here in the umbilical cord. Here's the two umbilical arteries, and here's the umbilical vein in the umbilical cord. And now I want to get into a discussion now of what the placenta is all about, now that we understand the umbilical cord. So finally, this picture is good to sort of show what's happening in the umbilical cord. And again, these two blood vessels or arteries are coming away from the fetal heart toward the placenta. So they're in arteries, and they're blue because they're deoxygenated. And they're going into the placenta in order to gather oxygen from the mother. And then they come back in the umbilical vein, and that's going toward the baby. And that contains, obviously, the red blood cells are what's carrying the oxygen, and the plasma of the blood is what's carrying the various nutrients, glucose, amino acids, all the things that the baby's going to need in order to grow. Okay, so let's try to orientate ourselves to this uterus again. Again, here's this uterus, and it has a very thick muscular wall. But embedded in the myometrium, again, there's this endometrium that's located up here. And so I'm going to attempt to draw this tissue right here, this endometrium. And so there's a lot of blood vessels that are coming right here. It's very vascularized, and so there's a lot of blood vessels. And I draw these as being red because they're carrying oxygenated blood from the mother. Okay, and so that's what you have right here in the uterus. There's a lot of blood vessels, and so what's also very interesting is that um, you can consider the placenta as being a contribution from both the mother and the baby. And so let's draw mom's input once again. And so mom's input has these urinary arteries that I'm going to draw in as red. That's what this is, these urinary arteries. Okay? These urinary arteries like this. And what's interesting about the urinary arteries is that they enter into this endometrium area. And what's fascinating about this, and it's certainly worthy of highlighting, is that what's kind of bizarre, a little bit, or I should not bizarre, but unusual, is that you might know that the blood vessels are usually enclosed, meaning like what is in an artery and then an arterial and a capillary. The blood stays within those blood vessels and then it returns in a venule and a vein. But in this case, what's happening is that um, what we've got going here is sort of this flattened tissue, and it's sort of like difficult to describe, but flat like a plate. Flat like a plate, and what's happening is the mother's blood is basically spewing like this into this enclosed area, which is known as the basal plate. So this area right here is the basal plate, and it's the mother's input in the placenta. And so what's basically happening is that red blood cells, I'll draw them as little dots when, as you know them, as being sort of these biconcave discs that have hemoglobin and carry oxygen, but also the plasma. So this is basically blood. These red blood cells are freely floating in this pool. Okay, and this is kind of wild because then what's happening is that there's also urinary veins that are doing this. Urinary veins. And so basically what you have floating here is the red blood cells and blood in general are forming a pool. So the blood can come out through a urinary artery and basically return in a urinary vein when it's deoxygenated. And so the blood is like pooling in here. So it's like a basin. And you can use different analogies here. You could say that it's kind of like a hot tub. And you can have like these are the jets like spewing out like this, and blood is forming into this pool. Okay? And then these are the drains, which will take the blood away from the pool in this direction. And so this is known as the basal plate. Okay, and so this area is forming, let's see, let me draw this in here. So this is basically forming this tissue, basal plate, which is like a pool reservoir of blood. And so the blood is coming out in here, and these are the red blood cells like there. And so what's in the blood, again, contains the red blood cells are holding most of the oxygen, and the rest of the blood has amino acids and glucose, so all the good things that the baby's going to want. So this is the basal plate, which is basically a pool of blood. It's a reservoir for the baby to get. And you're like, well, how's the baby going to interact with this? And so basically this is what's happening. Let's go back up here and consider this umbilical cord. So the umbilical cord is coming down, so the fetus is up here. Okay, so the umbilical cord is coming down, and if you recall, going away from the baby are these two umbilical arteries, and they're coming down like this. And so the tissue that I want to discuss here is that this fetal tissue comes around like this from the umbilical cord and forms like this, these blood vessels. And so it's going to interact with the basal plate. It goes like this, okay? And what this is called the chorionic plate. This is the fetus contribution, the fetal contribution to the placenta. And so let me erase a little bit here to give a little bit more space of what is happening. Okay, let me do that. Let's come over here and go like that. Okay, so this is where the blood is from the mother is pooling right in here in the basal plate. And so what's happening is the blood vessels, these urinary arteries, are then branching and branching and branching like this, branching and branching, again, to provide more surface area in order to get oxygen from the mother, okay? So these two are branching out like this, okay? And so what's happening is that the cells of the fetus, these particular cells are called trophoblast cells. And if you recall embryonic development, it's those trophoblast cells which are going to basically form what are known as the chorionic villi. And so let me get into that particular discussion. So the fetal cells will basically invade into, right in here, they'll basically protrude and invade into this pool of blood. And what's interesting about this is that what are inside these projections? Inside the projections, and basically it's not just one, but they branch out like fingers of a hand like this, so villi, if you're familiar with intestinal villi. So they try to do this. And remember, this is the pool of red blood cells, right, and down in here, and this is the basal plate. And so what's happening? Well, these blood vessels right in here, the deoxygenated arteries from the fetus are going to go in here like that, okay? And so what's going to happen is these red blood cells are going to give up their oxygen to the fetal vessels. Now, the blood in the fetus is enclosed, and so when this becomes oxygenated, it's going to return like this. And so what's happening is the glucose is going into the fetal blood, the oxygen's going into the fetal blood, and so it's becoming oxygenated. And so all of this oxygenated blood, and this is happening all down in here, all this oxygenated blood culminates into this one umbilical vein, which is going toward the fetus. And so this particular structure is called, again, I was mentioning the chorionic plate, which is made up of just blood vessels from the fetus. And what it does is it extends into the pool of blood in the basal plate in order to gather up oxygen and nutrients. And likewise, carbon dioxide, I'll emphasize that, carbon dioxide then travels because the baby is producing carbon dioxide. And so the carbon dioxide that the baby produces goes into the mother's blood, and again, that goes into this urinary vein and ultimately into the mother until she breathes it out of her lungs. So I find that to be most remarkable. And so what's happening here, you can see, all right, so this up here is the chorionic plate. You can see here's the umbilical arteries, here's the umbilical vein, and see how it branches out into these villi. And so this is that pool of blood right in here. So this is the basal plate. Down below, this is the mother. Here's the pool of reservoir, a pool of blood. And so oxygenated blood is traveling in here, and deoxygenated blood is coming out. And so the placenta is a combination of the basal plate, this reservoir of blood, and this chorionic plate, which is the fetal contribution. Again, this is an excellent diagram as well. Here you can see the blue umbilical arteries. Here's the red umbilical vein, which is traveling toward the baby. These two arteries are away. And I'll just follow this. So the baby needs oxygen. So here's the cells. Like here, they need oxygen. I need oxygen. So I'm coming in here like this. Where am I going to get it? I'm going to get it right there. And so the mother's red blood cell is going to give me oxygen, and then now the baby has it, and it's going to come back like this. And so the baby's now going to get oxygen via the umbilical vein. And so it's a cool combination of, it's a first example of mother and child working together. It's sort of this fetal portion of the placenta is the chorion, or the chorionic villi, or the chorionic plate. And then this maternal portion here is made up of the basal plate and this pool of blood. So that's kind of cool. And again, a real picture of the umbilical cord. You can see the blue umbilical arteries clearly present here. And then again, this is an actual picture of the placenta with the umbilical cord clamped right there. And so that's kind of neat. Um, and then one of the last things that I wanted to mention about the placenta is that, the normal location of the placenta is either up here in the top of the placenta, the apex, or on the side over here. It would be not a good idea if the placenta formed kind of abnormally right in the below in this inferior location inside the uterus of the lumen for obvious reasons. If the placenta was actually forming right here, look at this. It's blocking the cervix, and so the baby's not going to be able to be delivered properly. And this is known as placenta previa, and it's one of the things that a physician would be concerned about. And so during a routine ultrasound, a sonogram can be taken, and it shows here's the bladder. The bladder is always this sort of darkened structure. Here's the vagina, here the birth canal, and then here's the cervix. And then look at the location of the placenta. It's blocking. So this is placenta previa. And again, here's the placenta blocking the cervix. So this is what it would look like. And so what are you going to do? Well, this would be one of the reasons why a woman would want to have a cesarean section and have the baby delivered through a surgical procedure as opposed to a normal vaginal birth. And so let me finish with this. This is my son Bryce. This is his actual umbilical cord right there, and it's being clamped off. He doesn't seem too happy about it. But basically, that's a discussion of the placenta and an organ that forms inside the uterus in order to provide gas exchange and nutrient exchange between mother and fetus. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion of the placenta, and thanks for watching.